On the 23rd of March 2021, the world ran out of air. A container ship nearly 400 meters long lay wedged across the Suez Canal. There were no explosions, no gunfire, no attack, just steel blocking the way. The Ever Given had run aground, and with it, one of the planet's most critical trade routes. For 6 days, maritime traffic backed up on both sides of the canal. Ships lined up, stationary, cargo immobilized. Energy, food, industrial parts, electronic components, goods that sustain daily life, in dozens of countries hung suspended at sea. The cost was measured in hours, but the real anxiety wasn't about money. It was about the absence of alternatives. When governments and companies looked for a contingency plan, they discovered one didn't exist. There was no route capable of absorbing the volume in real time. There was no spare capacity waiting to kick in. There was no parallel system that could guarantee continuity. That accident didn't just block a canal. It blocked a certainty. The idea that global commerce was resilient by definition. Because modern economies look immense, but they operate on razor-thin margins. And when those margins disappear, a single piece can stop the entire machine. What was exposed was a fragility with a specific name: concentration. For decades, container shipping accumulated in the hands of very few players. Today, 3 giants dominate much of the planet's most strategic routes: Maersk, MSC, CMA, CGM. Among them, they control a decisive portion of global capacity, and on certain routes, their influence is even greater. Which means that much of what is manufactured in Asia and consumed in Europe or America depends on decisions made far from the public, far from parliaments, far from any social debate. This isn't the kind of power that announces itself. It doesn't present itself as a threat. But when a small group decides how much capacity is offered, which routes are prioritized, and what prices become viable, power stops being abstract. It becomes material. It becomes daily. And while headlines focus on tech moguls and digital platforms, the physical control of global commerce is exercised elsewhere, between ports, shipping routes, and contracts that almost no one reads. In that system, there are names that don't appear on front pages. One of the most influential is Gianluigi Aponte, founder of MSC. He built one of the world's largest shipping companies without cultivating a public image, without media conferences, without unnecessary exposure. MSC doesn't trade on the stock market. Its structure is private. It operates from Switzerland under family control. That means the level of publicly available information is lower than companies obligated to report to shareholders and markets. In the world of money, that silence is no accident. It's an advantage. And while the planet shared images of the grounded ship as if it were a curiosity, what mattered went unnoticed. That incident was a warning. Because the Ever Given didn't just block a canal. It blocked the illusion that global commerce will always find a way. What was exposed was something much larger. The world depends on maritime infrastructure that almost no one understands, that no one voted for, and that no one can afford to destabilize. What you're about to hear is not just the story of an accident. It's the story of how the maritime mafia was built, the crisis that changed everything. In 2008, the world watched Wall Street. Banks were failing, stock markets were collapsing, entire governments intervened to prevent cascading collapse. The bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers became the symbol of a financial system that had lost control. But while cameras pointed at New York, somewhere else a silent operation was being prepared. In the world's ports, international commerce contracted abruptly. Factories cut production. Orders were cancelled. And those giants that transported the planet's economy, ships hundreds of meters long, financed with debt and built to sail full, began crossing oceans with empty spaces. For a shipping company, a half-empty container ship isn't just a bad week. It's an open wound. Because a container ship isn't maintained with speeches. It's maintained with fuel, port fees, crew, insurance, maintenance, and debt, lots of debt. In the years before, the sector had lived through a race for size, more capacity, more efficiency, more volume. And to sustain that race, cheap credit did its job. It turned ambitious plans into signed contracts. Growth seemed infinite. The crisis ended it in weeks. Freight rates collapsed, demand fell, and many shipping companies, especially medium and small ones, discovered they had no cushion to survive. They had bet on large vessels and profitable routes. Without those routes, the model broke. What came next wasn't a spectacular headline. It was a cleanup. One by one, historic companies began disappearing. Some went bankrupt. Others were absorbed. Others sold their fleets, their terminals, their routes, their contracts, anything that could be turned into cash. Between 2008 and 2016, the map of maritime transport was rewritten without the public noticing. Because when a bank falls, you feel it. When a shipping company falls, almost no one notices until the ship doesn't arrive. And in each collapse, someone was buying. The major players did what major players do when the market bleeds. They acquired assets at reduced prices, expanded positions, and prepared for the next cycle. Maersk expanded its network and logistics presence. MSC consolidated routes and operational scale. CMA-CGM incorporated strategic competitors. From the outside, it looked like inevitable consolidation. From the inside, it was something else, the beginning of a game board. A board where the number of players shrinks, and each move matters more. But the most important shift wasn't the purchase of ships. It was the purchase of control. Because the major shipping companies understood a truth that transforms any industry. The money isn't just in moving goods, but in deciding how they move. And to decide that, you need more than ships. You need ports. You need terminals. You need ground logistics. You need warehouses, rail and truck networks, and digital platforms capable of managing everything from customs documentation to real-time tracking. That's what they started buying. Port terminals at critical points. Logistics and ground transport companies. Cargo management and routing systems. Infrastructure that turns a carrier into the owner of the road. From that point on, the business stopped being moving containers from A to B. It became controlling the complete journey. Today, a single company can pick up cargo at an Asian factory, move it by road to the port, load it on its own vessel, unload it at a terminal it also manages, transport it by rail or truck to a logistics hub in its network, and deliver it to destination. That's not just efficiency, it's dependence. When a company controls multiple links in the chain, the customer stops hiring a transport service. They're hiring a closed route. And when you hire a closed route, your options shrink. That's the difference between a market and a structure. In a market, you choose. In a structure, you adapt. The 2008 crisis accelerated that process because it eliminated the weak and strengthened those who could survive. And it did so silently, without public debates, without reforms, without the average citizen knowing that an unprecedented concentration was being born. But we're still missing the piece that completes the explanation. The container. Because the container was the invention that allowed this system to become something far more resembling a mafia than an industry. For decades, people believed ships only transported goods. But they actually transported something else: opacity. And to understand it, we need to go back to a time before 2008, when the world decided to put its economy in a metal box and seal it. That's where the real power was born. And when that power combined with the crisis, the result was inevitable: a market that stopped being a market and became a domain, the black box, the container, and the birth of opacity. Before discussing flags, alliances, or major shipping companies, you need to understand a piece that changed the world without making the headlines. A metal box. Rectangular, sealed, anonymous. The container is the invention that made globalization as we know it possible. It's also the invention that turned maritime commerce into a system where what matters travels hidden in plain sight. For most of the 20th century, loading a ship was slow, expensive, and exposed work. Sacks, boxes, barrels were moved. Each piece was counted, handled, and registered one by one. The cargo passed through many hands. Ports were cities within cities, crowded docks, cranes, crews, intermediaries. Dwell time was long, and where there's time, there's friction. Where there's friction, there are losses. Where there are losses, there's conflict. Mid-20th century, international commerce needed speed, and speed demanded standardizing what had been chaotic. The idea was brutally simple. Put goods in a uniform box, and move that box without opening it for the entire journey. The factory loads once. The port lifts once. The ship transports. The port unloads. The train or truck picks up. And the destination opens. One box, multiple modes of transport. What once required days of handling now required hours. What once involved hundreds of transactions became an almost automatic chain. That box transformed the distribution of power in ports. Port cities that had lived off labor-intensive work saw the need for crews reduced. Specialized terminals were built away from urban centers. Traditional docks became obsolete. The business stopped being moving cargo. The business became moving containers. And that's when the real mutation began. Because the container didn't just bring efficiency. It brought a side effect that, over time, became decisive: opacity. A sealed container is a promise. What the paper says. What the manifest states. What an operator declares. But it's also an opportunity, because not all of them can be opened. That's the point usually omitted from modernization speeches. The container turned global commerce into a system of sealed boxes crossing borders at a rate impossible to inspect completely. The world accepted that condition because there was no alternative. If every container were thoroughly inspected, commerce would stop. Ports would collapse, supply chains would break. The metal box became the basic unit of the global economy, but also its blind spot. And where a blind spot exists, actors appear to use it. Organized crime understood it quickly. Before, smuggling demanded direct contact, dispersed bribes, and constant risk. With the container, risk shifts. It's no longer about hiding goods at the dock, but introducing them at origin, sealing, and letting the system transport it as if it were regular cargo. The legal and the illegal began traveling the same highway. You don't need to imagine conspiracies to understand it. Just look at incentives. If a sealed box travels thousands of kilometers and can only be inspected a fraction of the time, control becomes risk-based selection. Documentation is analyzed. Data is cross-referenced. Patterns are detected. Specific units are scanned. Intervention happens where signals appear. That model is logical. But it's not foolproof. And when the volume is gigantic, even a small margin leaves enough room for things to happen. That's the first reason this system resembles a modern mafia. Not because of visible violence, but because its power rests on what you don't see. Now, the container explains the what. We still need to understand the how. How could an entire sector build a practical territory where responsibility dilutes, oversight fragments, and ownership becomes hard to trace? The answer lies in the next level of the maze. Not in the metal of the box, but in the paper that accompanies it. Imagine a container ship crossing the Pacific. 400 meters of steel, thousands of boxes stacked. On the hull, a flag, Panama. The captain might be Filipino. The crew might be from Southeast Asia. The commercial operation might be directed from Europe. The insurance might be contracted in London. The financing might have been signed at a continental bank. And when someone tries to answer the simplest question, who is the real owner of the ship, the mechanism that sustains the entire system appears. On paper, that vessel usually belongs to a company created for that single ship. An entity registered in a specific jurisdiction, with a name that means nothing, and with structure designed to separate the asset from any direct responsibility. That company, in turn, might be controlled by another entity in a different jurisdiction, and that one by another, and so on. It's not a rarity. It's a standard model, a corporate chain that distributes ownership and management in layers, each protected by the legal framework of where it's registered. This combines with another decisive element: flags of convenience. Countries like Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands offer registries open to foreign owners. The vessel flies that flag, pays fees associated with that registry, and benefits from a regulatory and tax regime more favorable than it would have under the flag of the nation where real decisions are made. Formally, it's legal. It's within international maritime law. In practice, it creates an effect. The link between the ship and the state whose flag it flies may be nominal. The flag state is responsible for certain obligations, but when a country administers thousands of ships spread around the world, its capacity to inspect or supervise each operation consistently is limited. And then, the third component of the maze appears: dispersed jurisdiction. A ship can be registered in Panama, commercially operated by a company based in Switzerland, with crew hired in Asia, transporting cargo originating in China to a US port. If there's a conflict, a commercial dispute, or an infraction, who's in charge? The flag state has formal authority over the vessel. The port state has authority over what enters and leaves its territory. The state where the company is based has authority over the company. The state where the cargo originated may have authority over the export. The consequence is clear. Responsibility is divided, and when divided, it dissolves. It's not that laws don't exist, it's that the laws aren't concentrated in one hand. They're divided by design, because global commerce demands crossing borders, and each border adds another layer. That is the real territory of the maritime mafia. Not a specific port, not a particular city, not a flag on the hull, but the practical space between jurisdictions. That space allows a different form of power, power without exposure, power without a face, power sustained by complexity. And there's a detail that makes it even more troubling. This maze wasn't built for crime. It was built for efficiency and profitability. But a structure designed to reduce transparency and distribute responsibilities always ends up generating fertile ground for abuse, errors, and operations no one detects in time. That's the paradox of the container. The invention that accelerated commerce was the same one that made it less visible. From here on, the story gets more uncomfortable. Because when an industry combines sealed boxes, massive routes, selective inspection, and ownership layered and dispersed, real control depends on something fragile: trust in the system. Trust that what's declared matches what's transported. Trust that the seal isn't tampered with. Trust that the operator doesn't look the other way. Trust that the flag state oversees. Trust that the port controls. And when that trust breaks, the world discovers that global commerce has no emergency brakes, only consequences. In the next part, we enter the moment when this structure began showing its true face to the public, not with theories, but with facts. The first major warning came when one of the largest pieces on the board couldn't hold up and collapsed, leaving ships stranded, containers abandoned, and ports turned into scenes of chaos. And then, it became clear that the system didn't just become opaque. It could become ungovernable. The shipwreck without sirens. When a shipping company sinks, there's a kind of collapse that leaves no wreckage in the street. No smoke. No sirens. No dramatic images of buildings falling. Just ships that stop moving, and containers that stop arriving. In August 2016, the maritime transport world witnessed a scene that anticipated what would happen years later, during the pandemic. One of the largest shipping companies on the planet, South Korea's Hanjin Shipping, collapsed. It wasn't a minor company, it was a global player. It operated key routes between Asia, Europe, and the United States. It transported merchandise for major brands and thousands of mid-sized shippers. And suddenly, it couldn't pay. The effect was immediate. Ships with thousands of containers were stranded at sea without permission to dock. Ports were afraid to unload cargo because they didn't know who would pay the fees. Fuel suppliers refused to refuel. Crews were trapped, with salaries in question. Insurers and courts began to intervene. For days, global commerce watched something most didn't know could happen. A ship can become a ghost. An asset worth billions that no one wants to touch. Containers of electronics, clothing, auto parts, and perishables were immobilized. Small companies lost entire inventories. Large firms had to reorganize emergency routes. And in ports, congestion multiplied, because containers that did arrive couldn't be repositioned quickly. Hanjin wasn't an isolated accident. It was a structural signal. The maritime shipping industry had entered a phase where the margin for error was minimal. Competition on price, pressure to build ever larger ships, and accumulated debt turned the sector into an environment where a drop in freight rates could be fatal. But the key point wasn't just the collapse. It was what it exposed. If a large shipping company falls, the damage isn't limited to its shareholders. The damage ripples outward. Because the shipping company isn't an ordinary business, it's an infrastructure node. If it disappears, it drags down ports, freight forwarders, shippers, truckers, and factories that depended on its capacity. That episode should have set off every alarm. It didn't. The system kept consolidating. The large absorbed the space left by those who fell. The industry, far from diversifying, concentrated further. And then 2020 came. The pandemic? The second major warning, but this time at planetary scale. In March 2020, the world stopped. Factories closed. Ports operated under restrictions. Crews had difficulty being relieved. Containers accumulated at terminals. The global logistics chain, designed to function with millimeter precision, began to fail. The reaction of the major shipping companies was swift. They canceled scheduled sailings. They withdrew capacity. They adjusted supply on strategic routes. In industry language, blank sailings multiplied. On the surface, it was a defensive measure. But it was also a demonstration of control. Because for the first time, the world watched how a small group of companies could reduce capacity in a coordinated way and, in doing so, alter the market balance. At first, it seemed the sector would sink with the economy. But the pandemic transformed consumption. The world didn't stop buying. It changed what it bought. Electronics, for remote work. Furniture for homes converted to offices. Sports equipment. Leisure products. Physical goods driven by e-commerce. The demand for containers returned with force. And the system wasn't ready. There were containers in the wrong places. Empties accumulating in ports where they weren't needed and shortages at origin. Ports began to saturate. Wait times skyrocketed. A ship could spend days, sometimes weeks, waiting for a berth. And as congestion grew, capacity remained insufficient. Freight rates exploded. Routes that had been relatively stable for years began registering prices that seemed impossible. The cost of shipping a 40-foot container from Asia to the US. West Coast hit peaks that multiplied several times pre-pandemic levels. It wasn't just the market. It was the consequence of a concentrated structure in which supply could be reduced quickly and recovered slowly. And here appears the element that for thousands of companies proved devastating: surcharges. The freight charge wasn't the only cost. As ports congested and containers accumulated, penalties for delays and detentions began mounting. Demurrage. The time a container remains at the port beyond an established period. Detention. The time a container remains outside the port, for example, in a warehouse without being returned on time. In theory, these charges exist to incentivize efficiency. Free up space, return containers, avoid saturation. In practice, during the logistics crisis, they became a factor of ruin for many small and mid-sized companies. Because in a congested system, the shipper doesn't always control the timeline. A container can take days to clear due to lack of appointments. A truck might not arrive because there's no availability. A port can impose restrictions. A warehouse can be saturated. But the penalty clock keeps running. Thousands of companies received unexpected bills, accumulated, difficult to dispute. They didn't just pay multiplied freight rates, they paid surcharges that stacked in chains. Many didn't go under from lack of sales, they went under from logistics. And while that happened, shipping companies recorded historic profits. The major players emerged strengthened. They expanded fleets, they bought more terminals, they consolidated routes. The perfect blow wasn't an illegal operation. It was a combination of global crisis, concentrated structure, and a surcharge system that shifted pressure downward. In 2022, the U.S. Federal Maritime Commission, the FMC, intensified investigations into charges, business practices, and market operations. It specifically examined the impact of demurrage and detention, as well as possible abusive behavior. But even with investigations, the problem remained the same. A national regulator can't alone rewrite a system that operates across multiple jurisdictions, under multiple flags, and through a global network of alliances. And yet, the crisis left one certainty. The pandemic didn't weaken the maritime mafia. It perfected it. It proved that the modern world can enter panic over a virus, a war, or a financial crisis, but that a logistics bottleneck is enough to translate that panic into the price of everything. And it left another, darker lesson. When the system is concentrated, crisis doesn't distribute losses. It concentrates gains. In the next part, we enter the territory that really reveals why governments are troubled by this power, geopolitics. Because one thing is that 3 private companies control capacity and prices. It's another thing that part of the critical infrastructure of world commerce is influenced by states competing for global power. There, the maritime mafia stops being just economics. It becomes strategy, ports, states, and power, the silent war. Until now, the maritime mafia might seem like a market problem. Concentration, prices, surcharges, opacity. But there's a reason this topic troubles governments, intelligence services, and military strategists. It's not just about the cost of moving goods. It's about who can interrupt it. In the 20th century, power was measured by oil, steel, and armies. In the 21st century, a decisive part of power runs through logistics, routes, terminals, cranes, containers, and berth schedules. Whoever controls the flow influences the economy without needing a naval blockade or open conflict. And the world depends on that flow more than it admits. The shift in scale, from companies to states. At the top of maritime shipping are large private European companies, but there's a different kind of player. COSCO Shipping. It's not a typical large private company. It's a Chinese state-owned conglomerate with global presence. And its influence doesn't stop at ships. It includes port terminals, logistics holdings, and long-term concessions. That nuance changes everything. When a private shipping company makes a decision, it answers to profit, costs, contracts, and market. When a state enterprise operates in critical infrastructure, its activity can also align with the strategic objectives of the state that controls it. It doesn't need to happen every day for the risk to exist. It's enough that the capacity is there. In 2019, the United States sanctioned a COSCO-linked subsidiary for transporting Iranian oil in the context of international sanctions. That episode left a clear lesson. Maritime transport isn't neutral by definition. It can become a tool of foreign policy. And if that can happen with oil, the relevant question is another. How much leverage exists when you participate in the entry and exit points of world commerce? Ports are no longer just ports. For decades, a port was national infrastructure. Today, in many places, a port is a network of concessions, operators, terminals, and companies that manage docks, cranes, and container yards through contracts lasting decades. That means real control doesn't always match the flag flying on the facade. A port can be in Europe, but a terminal can be operated by a foreign conglomerate. Security is still the state's responsibility, yes, but day-to-day operations, data, and internal logistics rest with whoever manages the terminal. And in a world where logistics is precision, information is worth as much as concrete. Berth schedules, loading patterns, discharge priorities, available capacity, preferred routes, dwell times, congestion. That kind of information isn't a technical detail. It's advantage. Modern geopolitics doesn't always need to interrupt commerce explicitly. Sometimes slowing it down, making it more expensive, or redirecting it is enough. The impact can be enormous without any public announcement. The vulnerability no one wants to face directly. Here enters the point that makes this topic truly uncomfortable. Global commerce moves in millions of containers. And the container is, by design, a sealed box. Total inspection is impossible without paralyzing the system. That's why ports work with risk-based controls, data analysis, selective scanning, profiles, intelligence, international cooperation. It's a reasonable model, but it has an obvious limit: volume. If you add layered corporate structures and registries under flags of convenience, the result is a system where essentials function, but where complete traceability is hard to guarantee in each case. You don't need to resort to wild stories to understand it. It's a matter of scale. A small margin, in gigantic volume, is still a large margin. And that's why analysis centers, like the Council on Foreign Relations and the CSIS, have warned about supply chain vulnerabilities and logistics infrastructure. Not because there's a permanent visible operation, but because the capacity to cause economic damage exists. And if it exists, it factors into strategic calculation. The political dilemma. Why no one breaks it up? Here appears the final problem. When a sector becomes this central to commerce, regulating it harshly is harder than it seems. Because true regulation isn't fining. True regulation is shifting the balance. Capacity, alliances, access to routes, vertical integration, market power. And if done abruptly, the cost isn't borne just by shipping companies. It's borne by supermarkets, factories, hospitals, and the common citizen. There's a reason why, after the logistics crisis, no global reform equivalent to major historic financial reforms was seen. Because the political system discovered a contradiction. The economy needs this infrastructure so much that any aggressive intervention can cause shortages, port chaos, and immediate impact on prices. That fear paralyzes. Not because there aren't problems, but because the cure can be worse than the disease if applied wrong. That's why authorities investigate, publish reports, announce adjustments, toughen certain controls. But the central mechanism remains. Because dismantling it means redesigning a critical part of international commerce, and that operation demands global coordination, time, investment, and enormous political cost. The most troubling conclusion: the maritime mafia doesn't resemble classic mafias because of violence. It resembles them for another reason: the way it becomes untouchable. Not by controlling the forbidden, by controlling the essential. That's the difference between a criminal group and a modern structure of power. One acts outside the system, the other embeds itself in the system until the system depends on it. And when dependence is total, accountability becomes fragile. Not because laws are missing, but because there's no single authority capable of enforcing them across the entire board. That's why a ship stuck in 2021 was more than an accident. It was an image of the world today. A world where a logistics failure can halt a significant part of global commerce, and where control of that flow concentrates in very few hands. The final question isn't whether this system works. It works. The question is, what happens when a system like this is stressed by a pandemic, a war, a trade dispute, or rivalry between powers? Because then, what seemed a technical issue becomes power. And power, when not transparent, always casts a shadow. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If you want me to keep investigating these structures of power that operate far from the headlines, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If this documentary gave you a different perspective, leave a comment and share the video. It helps more people understand how the world moves when no one is watching. See you in the next story.